So I'm photographing indoor basketball, and gymnasium sports are most parents' photographic nightmare because the lighting is so poor. So I'm going to show you how I set my exposures, and then I'll give you some ideas on how you can set yours. Now, looking around at the gymnasium, is the light changing? No, the light is not a variable. The light is constant. So what does that mean? So it's the same amount of light coming everywhere, illuminating everywhere in the scene, so I don't have to adjust my exposure setting. The brightness is the same everywhere. So how are we going to fill our exposure bucket to get the brightness just where we want it to be? My primary consideration is I want a shutter speed that's fast enough to freeze the action. So I know from experience that 1/500th of a second is enough to freeze just about any human action. So I know one setting that I need. Now, how do I get to my other settings? Well, now we get to the low light. So I know I don't have a lot of light here to fill my exposure bucket. So what do I need? Well, I need a valve as wide open as I can get to let as much light in as possible to the sensor. That's going to be my aperture. So I'm going to go to f2.8 or maybe around 3.2 to get some more depth of field on my aperture setting. So now that leaves the ISO or the sensitivity. And again, we don't have a lot of light, so do we want a huge bucket that's going to take a lot of light to fill? No, we want a smaller bucket. So what I'm going to do with my shutter speed and my aperture already set to what I want, I'm going to increase my sensitivity until the brightness looks right to me. So I go in the full manual mode because I know the light doesn't change, therefore my exposure settings will not need to change. So I can confidently set my camera at 500th of a second, at 3.2, even keeping the ISO the same. Once I find what works for one exposure, it'll work for all of them because the light doesn't change. And how do we know we have the right brightness? Well, it's subjective. It's what we want it to look like. Now, how do I check that? All right, so here's an example. The histogram, this little graph here, is toward the right side, but it's not all the way pressed up against the right side. Nothing is blowing out. When I look at the left side, I see nothing's touching the left side on the graph, which means there's no pure black either. So it means the entire picture is within the range of the camera's recording ability of brightness, and it means nothing is too dark, nothing is too bright. That's about where I want to be with exposure. Another way I tell if I have a good exposure is looking at the blinkies, and I see the only thing blinking is a little bit of glare from the glass on the hoop, which to me is not a problem. So that means, again, nothing important is blowing out here, so the exposure looks good. And also these cameras have a calibrated monitor, so I get a good idea of exposure from using these tools. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more videos from Constant Exposure.